This is another personal story from the 1939 edition, the first edition of the Alcoholics Anonymous Big Book. This personal story is called An Artist's Concept. It is noted here, but written by Ray Campbell in New York. He starts out by a quote. The quote is by Herbert Spencer. It says, there is a principle which is a bar against all information, which is proof against all arguments, and which cannot fail to keep a man in everlasting ignorance. That principle is contempt prior to investigation. Here's the story. The above quotation is descriptive of the mental attitudes of many alcoholics when the subject of religion as a cure is first brought to their attention. It is only when a man has tried everything else, when in utter desperation and terrific need, he turns to something bigger than himself, that he gets a glimpse of the way out. It is then that contempt is replaced by hope, and hope by fulfillment. In this personal story, I've endeavored to relate something of my experience in the search for spiritual help rather than a description of the neurotic drinking that made the search necessary. After all, the pattern of most alcoholic experiences fits a pretty general mold. Experiences differ because of circumstances, environment, and temperament, but the after effects, both physical and mental, are almost identical. It makes but little difference how or why a man becomes an alcoholic once this disease manifests itself. The preventative measures adopted for alcoholic tendencies in the future will have to be found in a more progressive program of mental hygiene and medical research than is now obtainable. It is important that at present we believe there is only one sure pathway for any alcoholic. In my own case, I was not entirely ignorant of the causes that led me into excessive drinking. In a desperate effort to eliminate these causes, to find a means to better mental and physical health, I investigated the alcoholic problem from every angle: medicine, psychology, psychiatry, psychoanalysis absorbed my interest and supplied me with a great deal of general and specific information. It led me, in the end, however, to the fact that for me, here was a mental and physical disease that science had placed in the category of incurables. Briefly, all that this study and research ever did for me was to show something about why I drank. It substantiated a fact I had known all along, that my drinking was symptomatic. It did point out a road to better mental health, but it demanded something of me in return that I did not have to give. It asked of me a power of self-will, but it did not take into consideration that this self-will was already drugged with poison, that it was very sick. Intuitively, I also knew that a person constrained to temperance by the domination of will is no more cured of his vice than if he were locked up in prison. I knew that somehow, some way, the mental stream, the emotions, must be purified before the right pathway could be followed. It was about this time that I began flirting with religion as a possible way out. I approached the subject in a wary, none too reverent attitude. I believed in an omnipotent God or deity, but the orthodox approach through the church with its dogma and ritual left me unmoved. The more I struggled to gain an intelligent grasp upon spiritual development, the more confused I became. On the other hand, a purely materialistic viewpoint that postulated a mechanical order of things seemed too negative, even to entertain. As an artist, I had spent too much time communing with nature, trying to place upon canvas or paper my emotional feelings, not to know that a tremendous spiritual power was back of the universe. There was, however, so much that seemed illogical or sentimental about religion in general. So many doubts assailed me, so many problems to be confronted, yet there was within myself a strong and urgent desire for spiritual satisfaction. The occasional periods in which I felt a spiritual emotion, I immediately examined with all the ardor of the inveterate analyst. Was this emotion just a form of religious ecstasy? Was it fear? Was it just blind belief? Or had I tapped into something? Most men, wrote Thoreau, led lives of quiet desperation. It was the articulation of this despair that led to my drinking in the beginning. Religion, so far, had only added to my desperation. I drank more than ever. A seed had been planted, however, and a short time afterward, I met the man who was, for the past 5 years, he devoted a great deal of time and energy to helping alcoholics. Looking back on that meeting, the simplicity of his talk with me was amazing. He told me very little of what I already knew, in part, but what he did have to say was bereft of all fancy spiritual phraseology. It was simple Christianity imparted with divine power. The next day, I met over 20 men who had achieved a mental rebirth from alcoholism. Here again, it was not so much what these men told me in regard to their experiences that was impressive, as it was a sense or feeling that an invisible influence was at work. When it was, this man had and these other men exemplified without their knowing. What was it that this man had and these other men exemplified without their knowing? They were human, everyday sort of people. They certainly were not pious. They had no holier than thou attitude. They were not reformers, and their concepts of religion, in some cases, were almost inarticulate. But they had something. Was it just sincerity that was magnetic? Yes, they certainly were sincere, but much more than that emanated from them. Was it their great and terrible need now being fulfilled that made me feel a vibratory force that was new and strange? Now I was getting closer, and suddenly it seemed to me I had the answer. These men were but instruments of themselves. They were nothing. Here at last was a demonstration of spiritual law at work. Here's a spiritual law working through human lives just as definitely and with the same phenomena expressed in the physical laws that govern the material world. These men were like lamps supplied with current from a huge spiritual dynamo and controlled by the rheostat of their souls. They burned dim, bright, or brilliant, depending upon the degree and progress of their contact. And this contact could only be made tainted just so long as they obeyed that spiritual law. These men were thinking straight, therefore their actions corresponded to their thoughts. They'd given themselves, their minds, over to a higher power for direction. Let me reread that sentence. They had given themselves, their minds, over to a higher power for direction. Here it seemed to me, in the one word, thought, was the crux of the whole spiritual quest. That as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. And so is his health, his environment, his failure, or his success in life. How foolish I'd been in my quest for spiritual help. How selfish and egotistical I'd been to think that I could approach God intellectually. In the very struggle to obtain faith, I'd lost it. I'd given to the term faith a religious significance only. I had failed to see that faith was our common everyday manner of thinking, that good and evil were but end results of certain uniform and reliable spiritual laws. Obviously, my own thinking had been decidedly wrong. Normal most of the time, it was abnormal at the wrong times. Like everyone's thinking, it was a mixture of good and bad, but mainly it was uncontrolled. I'd been sticking my chin out and getting socked by spiritual law until I was punch drunk. If one could become humble, if he could become as a little child, before this powerful spiritual thought force, the pathway, could be discovered. The day I made my first efforts in this direction, an entire new world opened for me. Drinking as a vicious habit was washed completely out of my consciousness. I had never been tempted to take a drink since. As a matter of fact, there's so many other things within myself that need correction that the drink habit looks silly in comparison. Please do not assume that all this was but an exposition of spiritual pride. A chart of my spiritual progress would look like the graph of a business that had been hit by everything but an earthquake. But there has been progress. It has cured me of a vicious habit. Where my life had been full of mental turmoil, there is now an ever increasing depth of calmness. Where there was a hit or miss attitude toward living, there is now new direction and force. The approaches of man to God are many and varied. My conception of God as universal mind is, after all, but one man's approach to and concept of the Supreme Being. To me, it makes sense, opens up a fascinating field of endeavor, and is a challenge, the acceptance of which can make of life the adventure magnificent. Join me in the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give me, Father, my daily bread, and forgive me my trespasses as I forgive those who trespass against me. Lead me not into a temptation, but deliver me from the evil one. For thine is the kingdom, and thine is the power, and thine is the glory, forever and forever, from age to age. Amen and amen.